Azul. It's me and Justin. Keynes, Guzman, Amazigh. I'm going to be talking briefly about the tense aspect system. It shouldn't take very long at all. Before I do that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about my experience in the practicum. I basically went in completely blind. I had no idea what I was getting into. I have never done any sort of fieldwork experience or even any sort of simulated thing ever before. And so I really just had no idea what this was going to be like. And we started with the first day, or with the first few days or so with the monolingual elicitation, which was honestly kind of overwhelming a bit. It's very difficult, having never designed an elicitation session before, and then trying to go in and communicate with some sort of barrier there. And I really wasn't expecting how difficult that was. And then when we switched to the bilingual elicitation, that was a little bit more comfortable, but it's still very difficult to design an elicitation session. I really wasn't expecting, whenever you're looking at some specific element, how inconvenient it can be to target specifically at just this element. And because you get so many, I mean, as an English speaker, you come in, at least I did, with these biases that just aren't mirrored in the language you're studying at all. And so they'll express things in entirely different ways. And it was very challenging. But I'm very grateful that Yamina was a wonderful instructor to work with and was very helpful in sharing her knowledge with us. And we had two great language consultants to work with who were very patient and willing to deal with me asking some really silly questions sometimes. But it was a very rewarding experience, and I really had a great time. So, tense and aspect, very briefly. First of all, with the aspect, it seems to be a three-aspect system. There's this base form, which is basically the normal form of the verb. Base form is a term that comes from the literature that I'm kind of uncomfortable with, but I don't know what else to call it, so base form it is. It's used whenever aspect isn't necessary. So it'll come in imperative sentences or sequential sentences where it's obvious, given the context, what is happening. Then there's an imperfective or intensive form of the aspect that comes in incompleted or iterative actions, and then a perfective form for completed actions, which is usually identical to the base form, but has some changes sometimes. So first, the base form, like I said, comes up with context where the aspect can be given from the situation. So the first example, dussuk, from go to the market, it's an imperative sentence, so the aspect is naturally given. And then for the second example, nichas I dussuk, I told him to go to the market, because there's some sort of sequence there, it's obvious that there's no aspect marker necessary. Aspect, or the base form is also used in verbs in future tense constructions. So like, ire dussuk aska, he will go to the market tomorrow. That's the base form of go. Du is used there again, which seems to imply that at least the future marker seems to be some sort of auxiliary verb-ish thing that conveys some sort of verbal quality on its own and negates the need for an aspect marker. That's something I want to analyze a little bit more, but I didn't really have the time to look at that. Then you have the imperfective form. Expresses some sort of incomplete or iterative action. So first we have the present tense form, die to dussuk, where the imperfective is marked with the geminate T in between the person marker and the verb, along with the habitual tense marker, da, at the beginning of the utterance. Then when you go into the past tense of imperfective, it changes slightly because past tense for de is marked on the verb. So you see that the difference between de and da the past tense is marked by the vowel change there. So I'm not sure exactly why this happens. Maybe it frees up this space at the beginning of the word that was previously being used for a tense marker. But that ikaten at the start is what marks the imperfective there, or at least seems to. And this marker changes dialectally. I've noted at the bottom that in Yamina's dialect it's tu instead of katen. This is also something I haven't looked at enough to really speculate more on. But then in the future tense construction, it uses the same form as the present habitual tense, where you have the geminate T marking because the future marker appears at the start again. And like I say at the bottom, this is just for one class of verbs. There are at least 2 other verb classes that I've noted. Some classes, instead of inserting a geminate T to mark the imperfective form, will simply geminate the first consonant of the verb. I have an example of that later on. And there's other classes that will insert a geminate consonant and make a vowel change. I don't have any examples of those in here because they seem pretty typologically rare, but examining those classes further is another future topic. And then we have the perfective form. It expresses just some sort of completed action. It's usually identical to the base form, as I show at the bottom. The first one, go versus go, completely identical there. Although in another class, there is vowel change, al versus yula for cry versus he cried. And so now to tenses. Past tense, compared to the other forms, is relatively unmarked. The most common change for past tense appears to be a vowel change, like in he went to the market, it changes from du to da. But in the example for carry, uzum being the base form there, for she carried, tozum, so there doesn't appear to be a vowel change there. Future tense is marked with this element ra or ira. They appear to be mostly in free variation. Amazigh seems very comfortable using them both. In the other dialects, they appear as ad or ad, depending on the environments for spirantization. But so you see, ire shuf aska, he is going to swim tomorrow. It's just marking that pretty simply. And then another example here, just showing that the marker can vary between ra and ira. And then the present or habitual tense for Amazigh dialect is marked with da, and it appears to be the same marker for Mustafa, the da. For Yamina, there's this lip da form, which they seem, I mean, the da versus lip da leads me to think that they were at one point the same form, and there has either been a clipping or some sort of additional change there. But it functions essentially in the same way as the future tense marker, just with this phrase initial element. And so you can see here, this is what I was talking about with the different noun classes. For he is going to the market, you can see that the imperfective is marked with geminate T. But for carry, instead of inserting a geminate T, you can see that the initial utterance is geminated to indicate the imperfective form. And that's all I have on tense, just a very brief overview. I will be back later to show you something else.
All right, I'm actually going to open with a disclaimer. So basically, when I try to pronounce these sentences, because I'm not using audio clips, I request that you look at me and not at the consultants, because I plan to speak with confidence, so it sounds as though I can pronounce this language. If you look at them, it may look a little more questionable. So I guess we'll start with that. So on that note, Ismino Travis, Nikin Sugujumor in Tamazir. So beyond that, second of all, I don't have my laser pointer, so I'm not quite sure what my hands are going to be doing during this presentation. So don't mind my left hand. And finally, I guess I'll start talking about what I'm here to talk about. So I'm working on argument structure. It's a terrible title, but it was the only thing I could come up with that encompasses in some way everything that I mean to discuss. So yeah, I'll be discussing some transitives, starting with basic transitives, discussing direct object clitics, and then eventually move on to negation and clitic movement. I'll then move on to passives and then causatives. And this may look like a very syntaxy talk for you, but this is the first time that I've ever separated myself from my theoretical work. So basically all I've done is collected as much data on this topic as I possibly could and try to make sense of it without any further intentions. So this was the part of CoLang that was a very new experience for me. So yeah, here's some data. So as we already know, it's a canonical VSO language with some exceptions. And notice that we have that if you remove the object and use a pronoun, it comes in the form of a clitic, which fortunately is only one sound, which gets very complicated when you're trying to separate morphemes. Well, anyways, the pronominal clitic actually takes place before the subject, unlike the actual object. When you add negation and keep the object, the word order remains the same. But as soon as you add negation, it drags the object clitic to the beginning. So you end up with negation, object, subject, verb, and then subject. So I guess what I should have said here is that this is subject agreement, but yeah, so that was a really interesting find. And then last night, I didn't have enough data yet, so I decided to also include this slide. I can't really say a whole lot about embedded clauses, but I had suspicion that any functional head would also drag a pronominal clitic to the front, which does actually appear to be true, because instead of being a chitit, we have a geminate ta, which takes a, which I'm assuming is drawn over by this complementizer is. So, yeah, I haven't investigated any other types of functional heads, but the two that I have function the same, or have the same outcome. So, passives. Another really interesting find was that I found two different passive morphemes. So, I mean, I won't talk about the active construction because I've already done that, and so has people before me. But we have this morpheme n, as well as tool. And the thing that was interesting about this is that I was getting both of them. And at first I was getting this n, and I couldn't quite figure out why all of a sudden I was getting this tw. And it turns out that it's dependent on the type of, whether there's an expected agent, whether the action could have been done by a human, whether it should have been done. I'm not sure if this is just a simple encodative causative alternation issue, where one of them works for the encodative and the other works for the regular passive, or the traditional passive as we know it in English. So what I mean by that is, well, I guess first of all, with a verb like read, you actually cannot get this passive marker. So this will take some more investigation to completely understand what's going on, but it's like a verb like break in English, where you can say the glass was broken by John, or the glass broke, but you can't say the glass broke by John. So I'm thinking that this might be the kind of semantic difference or dependency that varies between these two morphemes. And now for causatives. This is the boring part of causatives. The last section will be much more interesting, so bear with me. So basically, this is a very productive morpheme. You can add it to happy, and it becomes to make happy. You can add it to soft, as in the butter is soft, and you get he softens the butter. And it works like that with almost anything that you can think of, including verbs, although I didn't include any in the examples. But yesterday, I also started doing something else. And this was actually the most exciting elicitation session that I ever did, because I actually felt like I was a recording of one of those children's toys where you pull the thing and it says, the cow says, exactly. So that was actually the general structure of my elicitation session. I'm not sure who to cite for that, but anyway, so I just walked around and I was asking them, so in your language, what does a sheep say? And? Can someone give the sheep noise? I'm going to ask each of you if you're willing. Could one of you that actually speak the language? So that one is very similar. And interestingly, if you add the causative morpheme before it, it actually becomes the verb to back. Zbek, which is quite interesting. And then I got to horse. I wanted to show you my elicitation session, so it's very entertaining. The same thing stands, and that is also very similar to the horse sound in English. And then the worst possible onomatopoeia for an animal sound in English is our friend the rooster. So when I got this made a little bit more sense in Amazigh, I guess. This one I cannot pronounce at all, so I'm going to need somebody's help. Exactly. So, yeah, as I said, you add the causative marker, and it becomes the sound of the animal in a verb form. But yeah, so this is very productive, and the list of animal sounds that I have are very, very interesting, because none of them, or I guess like about half of them look something like the English version. The other half sound nothing like it, and I didn't realize how much I associate what I was taught animals say with the actual sound. But as I did this, it was an enlightening experience, to say the least. So yeah.
So I came to this totally new to linguistics, 1 year under my belt, intro class, and 1 year of phonology. And I kind of feel like a sprout of a linguist that a huge can of like fertilizer or fertilizer has been poured onto. So it's been a wonderful experience. It's been so interesting to work with consultants, and they've been so helpful and so understanding. And you know, my colleagues, some of them have so much experience, and some of them have just wonderful ideas and real passion for documentation. So it's been very inspiring to be here. so, yeah, we went through many different phases working together in this group. We started out, like we said, monolingually. So that was maybe just 1 or 2 days, I think, but it was an interesting couple of days, and we realized how difficult it is to work monolingually. So a lot of acting out, like, kind of things, you know, which is limiting, but has its purpose. And I was interested in Amazigh because I knew so little about the region, but also it's such an interesting and linguistic language. So originally I was going to work with Travis, and we were going to try to build the biggest sentence we could with as many morphemes. But then later things developed and we all got our own topics. So I'm going to talk a little bit about reflexives and verbs. Okay, so with reflexives, it's really just the verb and reflexive pronoun. You can say the whole phrase like that. So the verb is inflected for person and tense, and the reflexive pronoun is inflected for person, tense, and number. So there's kind of duplication there. And all of this is true for all three varieties we were talking about. So when I say that they're inflected, I'm talking about prefixes, infixes, and suffixes. And Tashmeet and Amazigh are very similar in terms of reflexives, but Yemen's dialects really don't have much in common except the verb root. Okay, so this is in Yemen's East Nelson. So here we can see a imanino, which means I wash myself. So here we have the verb, and past tense, as I think Travis was saying, are not marked, or not usually marked. So washed, and then it's always constant. It's always first person singular, so we often see this particular morpheme come up all the time. Imanino just means myself. Iman seems to be the base form of the reflexive pronoun, and then ino is first person singular. So then it stays almost constant, except when you put it into habitual instead of past, you get this prefix and a little infix there. So for second person plural masculine, we see this siavum imantim, which this is the constant second plural masculine morpheme we always see. And then for feminine, we get the feminine morpheme, as in everything else we see. Okay, so Amazigh and Tashmeet are pretty much the same, except there's 3 morphemes that are different. Everything else is constant. So in Tashmeet, you would have this ending here, and other than that, they're completely the same. Okay, so they have totally different morphemes, except sir stays the same. And because, like in Yemen's variety, everything is spiritualized, here we have the hardening that we see often in the other 2 dialects. So isir, iflinus, and then here's the habitual form. So we have this prefix and an infix here. Okay. So in plural, we see the plural marker, which is n, which we see in all kinds of noun plurals, and here we see it on the verb. Okay, and the sentences all stay the same, so you can really fit any verb into that slot. So, sir di femenino Wait, no, sir, vino. I wash myself. You can actually change to wet if vino. Or I hit myself. You can just switch out verbs. And same with Yamin's dialect. Sir de Imanino can just become Iwet de Imanino. Okay, so for plurals, actually it gets much more complicated and they're really not as constant as the other reflexive forms. There's 5 classes of plurals. The standard form is the initial vowel raises, and there's an "in" suffix that is added. So that's what we see in most of the plural forms. But we also see several others. So in the second class, it's 2 internal vowels in the word change. The initial vowel raises, and the final vowel lowers. In the third form, the initial vowel raises, but there's an "a" suffix. And in the fourth one, which is kind of interesting, there's gemination with the consonants, plus an I prefix, plus an "un" suffix. Sometimes the geminate consonants harden, and sometimes vowels change. But it's due to a lot of complicated phonological rules and rule ordering. In the fifth, it's sperantization and vowel change with an "un" suffix. So some examples, and this is all in Isnasi. So we have Papunas goes to Pipunasi, which is very, very standard. That's the standard plural form. The one curious thing is that the S here becomes geminate, but it's possible that it was geminate in this form and somehow that was dropped when it was in a singular form. In the second class, the 2 vowels change. So the initial raises and the final one lowers. So Antuka becomes Induka. That's also very standard. In class 3, the initial vowel raises and then there's an "a" suffix, and you drop the final C. So Tawuf becomes Tiwara. In class 4, geminate final C, there's an E prefix, E suffix, and possible vowel change, possible hardening of geminate consonants. So Wuf becomes Ibatu. So here we see, this is hardening, which doesn't always happen. And then here's another example without that Us, that's. And in the last one, it's sperantization with the U suffix and vowel change. So Azekor becomes Izekhar. Due to the phonological complexity in Amazigh, there's lots of exceptions. And this one isn't such a big deal, but we might wonder why in class 1, when there's only supposed to be a vowel raising and a suffix, this t becomes which seems kind of strange. But what we don't see is what's underlying. So in this case, the masculine singular form of the word is abara, and the feminine form loses the regular final and becomes t, but the underlying resurfaces in the plural. So it's just a lot of complexity that comes out later. Oh, I thought I would mention, we haven't really talked a lot about this, but some things can become interesting that we start to elicit one thing and cultural information kind of comes out as we're doing it. So when I was asking Amazigh to pluralize earth, he couldn't do it. He could only add a number in front of it, I think. Because why would you have more than one earth? Maybe it's uncountable in its variety. And I had a long argument with Mustafa because it's technically possible to pluralize beard. But why would you pluralize beard and not a person with a beard? Why would you say, and I said, well, what if I drew a picture of 10 beards? And if it didn't have a face attached, how would you know it was a beard? Yes, so that went on a while. But, So that is pretty much it, but talking about kind of classifications like this semantically, we got into emotions. And lots of interesting information came out of that we really didn't expect. It turns out that in English, we have 1 trillion different emotions that are not necessary in Amazigh. There's no surprise. There's happy if it's a good surprise. Just, it was very different. It's really eye-opening. So, I think that's it. Thank you.